Do you think that Israel's judiciary needs to be reformed?
Yeah, I think nobody disagrees with that idea. The question is, what does reform mean?
Right.
So I was a consultant before I was a journalist, and it's a similarly vague term. Like, what does a consultant mean? A consultant can mean anything, so can reform.
Parasite. 1, 2, 3.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being with me today. I'm so happy.
Happily. Welcome to my new apartment.
I'm so happy to be in this new apartment. You've got lovely light, as you promised.
Thank you. Lovely light, half furniture.
Half furniture. Yeah. That's all right. In here, we've got most of it.
We've got everything we need in this specific room. That's true.
It's true. But that's okay. All right. So I wanted to talk about your journalistic endeavors first. I think that's the biggest hot topic in Israel right now, obviously, is the judicial reforms, the protests, which are getting bigger every day, it seems. So take it away. I just read your article from last night. Very nice work.
Thank you. So it's interesting. I think one way that I've been trying to explain this to people who maybe don't live in Israel and don't kind of live and breathe this for the last few decades is that in many ways we're at an inflection point, right? We're in our 10th week of protests against what people are calling maybe the potential end of Israeli democracy. And then supporters are saying this is a long necessary rebalance to the judicial system, which is basically overrode in their point of view certain values and decisions made by the right wing predominantly. But in many ways, I think Israel's much like it ever was, right? We still have the same kinds of political tensions. We have the same religious and secular divides.
Are they the same?
They are.
Because it does seem like it's different.
So what's different is that it's playing out this time through judicial reform. But if you look at reform, the reform conversation, and what people who are for and against it are saying, it's ultimately playing out against those lines. If you're listening to backers from the far right and the ultra-Orthodox segments of society who are predominantly the ones pushing these reforms, the far right is saying something along the lines of, hey, this activist court doesn't stand up for settlement rights, doesn't agree with a lot of decisions that were made during the disengagement in 2005, if you remember 2004, 2005, when Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. The High Court upheld decisions to hold demonstrators in custody until the end of the disengagement. And that's an open wound still for many in this community. They still bring it up today. We had members of Knesset and ministers talking about this this week.
Well, it makes sense because you've got Ben Gvir talking about a heavy hand on the protesters, firing the Tel Aviv police chief. I mean, that's...
And it's so interesting because Ben Gvir is a character. How did he first get to know the police? Well, it was by clashing with them. Ben Gvir was someone who was considered too extreme even to join the IDF when he wanted enlist when he was 18 because he already held Jewish extremist views, which he was ultimately indicted and convicted for supporting a Jewish terrorist group and for incitement of racism. And then he's actually, in his law practice, before joining politics, legally defended Jewish terrorists, incling the man who firebombed and killed members of the Dewabsha family. Right, exactly. You knew what I was going to say because of how much of a stain on Jewish society and how much it was,
Well, as far as he's concerned, there's no such thing as a Jewish terrorist, which I think that in and of itself is a pretty charged argument.
Yeah, well, the law doesn't agree, but...
I mean, sure, yeah. My personal ideology is if you use violence for a political gain, that's terrorism. And I would agree that Jews are far less involved in terrorism. I don't like to use broad sweeping brushes in any case. But to say that there are no Jewish terrorists is that's just not true.
It's just not true, right? It's just not true. And I think what happened in Hawara a few weeks ago, where on the heels of terrorist attack, far-right settlers basically took justice in their own hands and carried out vigilante violence. While this is not directly tied to judicial reform, it's part of that same shift, this feeling of, hey, we're in power now. And what Ben Gvir is doing on the security front, trying to get rid of the Tel Aviv police commander because he says that you're not hard enough on these nonviolent protesters. It's because Ben Gvir sees the police as sort of a military force because that's how he experienced it, right?
That's how he's turned it into that.
He's trying to. He hasn't done that yet. We can talk about the legislation he's trying to pass to get more
we absolutely
control over it. But the Attorney General even this week said you can't, right? You're overstepping and you can't, which is why Ben Gvir is trying to fire her. And this takes us down a different rabbit hole. But my point is, it's kind of the same story. It's this idea of we're in power now and we want the judicial system, which is the main check against politicians in Israel, because remember, we don't have a constitution. We want that to reflect more of our values. And so that's the far right story. And then you can also look at the ultra-Orthodox story, which goes back 30 years. Remember, there were ultra-Orthodox protesters on the streets outside the court, long upset about, we talked about religion and secular, about the way that they feel that the court interferes with the way they want to live a religiously guided lifestyle.
Which is fine, but not everybody wants that, and stop pushing it on them.
Right, and not everyone wants it, and not everyone wants the resources in the state to be divided unequally in a way that disproportionately benefit the community, which is part of the frustration there. And the bigger fight, as I'm sure you all know, is about enlistment into the IDF.
Oh,
right?
Yeah, that's a big one.
Right?
Well, that's why we had 5 elections, essentially.
It is a huge part of it. It kicked off this 5 election cycle.
Yeah.
Right, when a right-wing politician left the government over this issue, and it's crazy to think this has taken us full circle back to the point where we're overhauling the judiciary. We're upending judicial power and massively increasing political power potentially because of this kind of perfect storm of interest, far right wanting to push more settlement-driven values, and the ultra-Orthodox wanting to preserve certain community ways of life and benefits, chief among them this idea of military exemptions from IDF service if you're a full-time yeshiva scholar, scholar.
I have to say, I think that it ultimately negatively impacts the religious community as well, because it's, in order to comply with the law, you end up funneling it really in order to get out of service.
Yeah.
You end up funneling a ton of Haredim into the yeshivot who ultimately don't want to be a rabbi.
So this is really interesting and idiosyncratic about Israel. You want to get back to the reason why this whole military exemptions issue is on the table at all. It's,
go back to Ben Gurion.
Exactly, right? There were 400 people left, and Ben Gurion wanted to let them leave out, a Haredi lifestyle with dignity, and to never thought that it would be such an issue where we have 13% of the state today is Haredi, and half of the men in the sector don't work and rather engage in full-time religious study. You go to the United States, and people study, but they also work. And historically, who full-time studied for their entire lives? The best scholars. You didn't have a system where the state funded everyone to full-time religious study.
No.
And this is part of the massive divide between religious and secular community. It's not just about religious values, it's about sharing the burden in the state. And that's what Lieberman was upset about.
Well, and that's why personally I don't think the military is necessary for everyone, but some sort of national service is great. It can be in the community. It doesn't. You don't even have to go far. Do a national service in Bnei Brak.
Yeah. So that's something that's been discussed as well. It's something the community remains very apprehensive about. I'll say national service is something that has been more embraced by Arab sectors of Israeli society because you can do it in the community, especially among Christian Arabs. Mm-hmm. Obviously the question is whether or not you'd want to pull the plug on this now entrenched system that supports you and your family through your yeshiva study. A lot of these families are poor, right? About half of ultra-Orthodox children live below the poverty line because of this system whereby men overwhelmingly don't work in the community. And then, compounding upon this, the ultra-Orthodox parties have pushed to basically further disincentivize learning that would let their community members actually integrate into the workforce. Core curriculum, right? We had this fight before the election, before our fifth election under 4 years, happened in November. But we had this fight where the government, the last government, basically had the Haredi parties on the ropes. And they were about to agree to this huge deal to integrate some level of English, math, science studies into Haredi private education schools, publicly funded separate schools.
Yeah.
And then Netanyahu said, stick with me, don't deal with them, we'll form a government together, and I'll give you all the funding without need to add core curriculum.
Yeah.
And there went that. There went the next generation of Haredi youth having the ability to integrate into the workforce.
So here's a very legitimate question is, do you think that we, coming from the United States, with American ideals and values maybe instilled in us, are coming, I don't know, half-cocked maybe to the argument, coming with a mentality that is incompatible with the democracy that Israel sees itself as?
Do you mean in terms of expecting liberal democratic values to keep surviving here after 75 years of their survival here? Or this idea of the extent of integration of religion in the state and the Jewish character that is imbued in the state?
I think more in terms of the idea of, for example, when I hear Ben Gvir and Netanyahu and whoever else talking about, well, this is democracy. It's majority rule. And that's true. but is it the kind of democracy that Ben Franklin warned against?
Yeah.
Where it's two wolves and a sheep?
Yeah.
Or is it the democracy that that Israel says it wants to have, like in the United States, which is a representative democracy and a republic, and has that constitution in place in order to preserve the rights of the minority?
Yeah. I think it's pretty clear, actually, to everyone, including coalition members, that a liberal democracy, which is what we enjoy in the United States, which is what we've enjoyed in Israel up to this point, requires checks and balances. Israel has a very idiosyncratic system in that we really only have two branches of government, because our Knesset, which is the legislature, from the Knesset emanates the government itself, which is the collection of ministers who kind of lead the ministries and lead Israel in its direction.
To a degree, it's the same in the States.
Yes and no. It depends on who's in power, right? We have a bicameral legislature, and each of those each of those houses can have a different party in majority, and then you have the executive, and so you might have a situation where two against one or three all line up with the same party's control, and then more than that, you actually elect your politicians directly on the national level in the United States. Whereas in Israel, you're only voting for a party. So basically, you have the 10 or 11 or so party heads are the only accountable politicians in the Knesset, and all the MKs are basically accountable to those party heads, with the exception of Likud members, because they have some sort of quasi-democratic process, and then labor and religious Zionism also open to that. But really, you have most of the MKs in this government are really just accountable to their party head. Right, and that's Yair Lapid's party. That's Benny Gantz's party in opposition. Those two parties. That's definitely UTJ and Shas, where their rabbis also choose them. And so you have this weird system where you've only really elected maybe 11 people, and the idea that this system, that the voter, who by the way, this election only came down to like 30,000 to 40,000 votes, because the way that the weird thing called the electoral threshold works, and the parties who came really close to making it into Knesset but didn't, had the parties that came close but didn't make it into Knesset, I mean the left-wing parties and this independent Arab Palestinian Nationalist Party,
we would have gone to another election.
We would have gone to another election. So this idea that the voter said they want this is kind of ridiculous to me. In addition, because the only party that gave voters a judicial reform platform before the election was religious Zionism. Likud basically ignored it. The Haredi parties, had their own messaging, but this was not clear to most voters that this would be the exclusive thrust of this government. And we're talking about passing this massive package, which would make the Supreme Court, make politicians and the coalition specifically, the coalition able to directly appoint judges, anyone they want, without having to really consult other authorities as they do today, as well as creating this mechanism whereby they could preemptively shield laws from any sort of judicial review, or if laws were, found to be inappropriate by the court because they conflict with one of Israel's quasi-constitutional basic laws, what do you know? You just repass that law with an amendment within it saying that it has this preemptive immunity, and we're all good. So you could basically override court decisions. Like these are the
before
two
they
big
make
things.
any decision.
Exactly. So these are the two big things that the coalition wants. There's other things included. When you look at this package in its totality, basically saying that politicians are unrestrained. There's no court check. And because we don't have a constitution, because we basically have two branches of government, because legislatures are not directly elected by constituents, and we have only one nationwide constituency, these are the reasons why the Supreme Court is the most important check on political power, and constraining it means that we basically have tyranny of the majority.
Do you think that Israel's judiciary needs to be reformed?
Yeah, I think nobody disagrees with that idea. The question is, what does reform mean?
Right.
So I was a consultant before I was a journalist, and it's a similarly vague term. Like, what does a consultant mean? A consultant can mean anything, so can reform.
Parasite.
Again, that's just right. But no, there's many things. There's some people who say that the reform should start with actually, making a constitution. That should be the biggest thrust of reforming the judiciary. There's others who look at the other side.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest surprises to me, really, is that they're talking about basic laws as if it's a constitution, and yet at the same time arguing for easing the threshold to changing them.
Yeah. There's the threshold for changing them is actually already quite low.
Yeah.
It's literally just a majority of voters who happen to be in the Knesset at the moment. It's nothing.
Which is nothing.
You're saying
that's that every law is a basic law then.
Exactly. A basic law is supposed to be these first draft chapters of the Israeli Constitution, which again we never could agree on to pass, and yet you can pass it with 32 votes as long as you had 31 or less against. Which is insane. We have 61, 61 is the majority in our 120-seat Knesset.
Right.
And so there are all these talks about, raising the threshold for passing a basic law, especially if we want to give basic laws some sort of protection from the court and saying the court can't touch them. But the coalition right now doesn't want to change the threshold for the basic law, but wants to say that the court can't touch them because they're quasi-constitutional.
So where do you stand? Okay, then if we can agree, and I think we do agree, that some sort of reform is needed because the courts have found themselves overstepping in the past, making opinion-based decisions as opposed to ones based in law. And we've seen that. The question then is, what about this law is good?
Yeah. So there's some stuff that really should be done, and that there's kind of a wider agreement that should, be enacted. You mentioned that the court kind of makes these exercises its discretion, let's say. It has this test called reasonableness. This obviously hit the news.
Which is huge.
Right, it's huge. They basically can decide a government decision is unreasonable and cancel it.
Yeah.
So I think curtailing that. One proposal I've seen is to... and this didn't come from the coalition, but one proposal is to say that the court can't interfere with political decisions, maybe ministerial decisions, like coming from the ministry, not the minister himself. It could interfere with, but not political decisions. So appointments of ministers, appointments in general, that it wouldn't be able to touch. Another thing is that people, we talked about a constitution. People are saying on the other side that we need to also just improve the judicial system. It needs something like 300 or 400 more judges and take some strain off the Supreme Court, which, by the way, is also the Court of Appeals in Israel. And so we should create a separate Court of Appeals, and we should create a separate We should add additional judges, and that would take some of the strain off the Supreme Court and also take some things out of its purview just naturally by doing that.
How do you feel about that?
I think that makes a lot of sense. Israel has a very slow judicial system. Israel also has a
slow everything system.
I know. We talked about my moving process today, so you know how I feel about service in this country.
Yeah. It's a beautiful apartment. It's very nice.
Great light.
It's very good lighting.
Right, but if you think about adding justices, I think that's a no-brainer. You need to actually just kind of get around to actually doing it. Another thing that the coalition is considering now, if you believe reports, is somehow raising the bar for actually passing those basic laws. That is something that the opposition has said that wanted, something that the president said that he wanted, make it harder to pass those basic laws. I think that makes a lot of sense. Right? You can't, as you said, to your point, you can't on one hand say that this law is special and it has...
Yeah, this is a basic law. Yeah. It takes a simple majority to make.
And then you can't touch it.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is most of these reforms being pushed through Knesset right now, because they're really being pushed through in a legislative blitz, are amendments to basic laws. Right? And so with the coalition's 64-seat power, it can just shove anything through the Knesset. It doesn't need an opposition vote, and it could radically change the way that our judiciary works. And that's the fear, right? That's why we need the court as some kind of check. And that's also what people are saying the next battleground will be, by the way, because we might head into a situation where the court's now not allowed to invalidate basic laws, but then invalidates a basic law, and now we're in a constitutional crisis, and then who do we listen to?
Right. Do you think that this law, if passed, will turn Israel into a dictatorship, or is that a fatalist speech, talking point from the left?
I think this law, if passed, will make Israel much closer to Hungary, to Poland, to Turkey than I would ever feel comfortable. If you combine what politicians are talking about with their rhetoric on the fact that this is about redistributing power in the state, alongside attacks on the media. Bills have been put forward to block one-sided one-sided voice recording, so journalists couldn't, record anymore. There've been a lot of important kind of investigations that were based on recordings like this, including
from a former journalist. That last one, which is interesting.
From a former journalist, former right-wing journalist. That's one thing. There's been a long push to close the state-funded public broadcasting channel.
They've been talking about that forever.
They've been talking about it forever, but they're now renewing the push. Right. They're renewing the push. It was put a little bit on the back burner because Likud told the communications minister, whoa, buddy, this is not the scrutiny we want right now. Let's finish judicial reform and then let's kill Khan, the public broadcaster. Also, we have a Eurovision coming up and you need the public broadcaster to be part of. You
need the public broadcaster for Eurovision, you guys. What's wrong with you?
Noah Carroll is performing Unicorn. So
yay!
Exactly. I think that what it will do, if passed in its current form, it would strip protections for civil liberties, and that's something Rothman himself, Simcha Rothman, who's one of the architects of this reform, admitted that he's not sure that civil liberties will be still protected, but trusts that people will, by convention, agree that these are good ideas, because things like equality, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, these are not enshrined in Israeli law. These are civil liberties that the court read out of its interpretation of basic laws, and that the coalition's overhaul wants to say are inappropriate, because the coalition's saying that you could only invalidate a law against a basic law if it is explicitly stated in the basic law that something would be invalid. So you'd have to say in the basic law that you have equality, and if a law infringed upon equality, then it can be chucked out. And mind you, this coalition also has already submitted bills to say things like, if it's you can discriminate based on religious observance. So if you are a kosher bakery and religiously observant, and an LGBTQ group comes to you and says, hey, can you bake us rainbow cake? You're allowed to refuse service.
To be perfectly fair, you have that in the States as well as a private service. I mean, that was the whole. There was that argument a couple of years back with a baker who said, listen, I'm not comfortable making a cake for your wedding.
That's true, but I think sometimes we conflate United States and Israel as the same country.
Totally, but I'm right. Just saying, in a free market economy, I think that you can have. I think that the issue is when you get into discrimination on that sort of basis from a public
entity. So what another bill that's being pressed, by the way, is to say that you can have gender segregation in public events if there's a religious reason behind it. So crazy. Yes, there is. But I do think that this idea of removing protections for equality that are currently enshrined in law is problematic. If there's a law already on the books saying this is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and then you take that law away, that's saying something.
Yeah. Like, why would you do that? What's the interest?
Right. There's a reason you want to roll back. You want to roll back some of those protections. And so I think Israel's going to be a dictatorship. I think that this is the...
So that's it. That's a strong word to say Israel will be a dictator.
No, I said do I think.
Oh, do I
think.
Sorry.
I think that this will lead to a lot of democratic backsliding. It would remove a lot of the protections. It would lead to a lot of democratic backsliding. It would remove a lot of the protections that Israelis have become accustomed to and would basically clear a path towards such thing as a dictatorship. Do I think Israel will become a dictatorship? No, not tomorrow. But I think that these things happen very quickly when they start happening. It causes a lot of fear.
Do you think that that's the intent?
No, I don't think the intent is to make Israel a dictatorship. I think the intent is to rebalance power. Now, they say it's rebalancing power.
So, I mean, again, the road to hell paved with good intentions. But, you do think that they have good intentions behind these decisions?
So, the coalition will say that they want to, quote, rebalance power among the authorities, meaning between the judiciary and political. What they really want to do, and this is what they'll then say in the next sentence, is that they want to rebalance power between what is perceived as an Ashkenazi European elite of Israeli Jews to settlers, to Mizrahi communities. They'll say, look at the court, and the court looks overwhelmingly Ashkenazi. We want to see more people who look like us. We want to see more people from the far right. We want to see more people who are Mizrahi on the court. That is fair. What is not, I think,
even so that I don't like, because that's identity politics.
It's identity politics, but there's a long history of discrimination in this country. We feel it less in our generation because at this point everyone's mixed, and what's mixed in Israel, it means Ashkenazi and Sephardi or Mizrahi. In the States, you would never call a Jew who had a Mizrahi, mom and a Ashkenazi dad mixed. You'd call them Jewish here, but that's mixed. And so this is much less of a tone as it used to be, but there's still a feeling around that. There's still a feeling that the center of Israel is a wealthier, more Ashkenazi, more elitist kind of piece of society, and that there are more traditional communities, more religious communities outside of the center who feel themselves less well represented by the court, and also feel that a lot of the decisions that the court has made have infringed upon something that they hold dear. I think that there's a genuine desire to fix that. I think that by fixing that the way that the coalition is approaching it, it's also entrenching political power, and that two of the politicians leading this charge are doing it for ideological reasons, less so than pragmatic ones.
You're talking about Smotrich?
No, I'm talking. Smotrich is more pragmatic in this issue. I'm talking about Simcha Rothman, who's in Smotrich's party and leads the Constitutional Law and Justice Committee.
I meant to say Rothman as well. Wow. Okay, yeah.
Right, they're in the same party. And I'm also talking about Justice Minister Yariv Levin, who is Netanyahu's closest confidant in Likud and has for 20 years been saying we need to make these kinds of changes. In Likud, obviously, the party has become much more supportive of this type of reform in the last few years. As you might remember, right. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is currently on trial in 3 corruption cases. He steadfastly holds his innocence, and his supporters say that this is a witch hunt. And so that has really degraded trust in the judicial system. And so when you have this perfect storm of interests, where you have some Likud voters supporting this, not all, some, and then the majority of far-right and ultra-Orthodox supporters wanting it for very pragmatic reasons, you have this coalition, this very unique coalition. All the coalition members will tell you this. This is their only chance to pass this kind of reform, pushing this reform through and calling it the will of the people.
Do you think that, because I've talked to a couple people on this now, and it sounds like Netanyahu doesn't have a choice in the matter. That if he wants to keep his coalition, this is how he's going to do it.
Yeah.
That there's not really anywhere to go for him here. He needs to do this.
There might be somewhere for him to go. He's definitely going to have coalition problems. The way he could address this is by answering each segment of his coalition's problems specifically. For example, one thing that the president put forward is, instead of having an override clause, which is what the Haredi parties want to overcome another Supreme Court strike down of their military exemption bill, to just create a basic law that instantiates some sort of immunity, or like some sort of exemption from military service if you are a full-time yeshiva scholar. Yeah, that would be a way to do it without having the override clause.
But if there's anything that we've learned, it's that the override clause is meaningless. Or not the override, that basic law is meaningless as a basic law because we don't have a constitution. It can be changed by the next government. And so, devil's advocate here,
yeah,
that's not good enough.
Except you could put into basic law something that raises the threshold for changing it. So there's a limited number of basic laws, especially clauses over elections, which require, let's say, 90 MKs to change, to amend.
Right.
And there are other ones that require, let's say, 61 MKs to amend. So there's a way to give that a little bit more oomph. But your deeper question about whether or not Netanyahu's coalition is in trouble, no one in this coalition thinks that it's going to last. This coalition came together because each party in this coalition needed each other. There was no other coalition for any party in this party to sit in. We had 5 elections over this question of yes or no to Netanyahu, who's Israel's most popular but most divisive politician, over his personal leadership. If Netanyahu left Likud, then we'd have a coalition that included the right-wing members of the current opposition and probably did not include the more extreme far-right members of the current coalition. That is the general consensus of what would happen. One of Netanyahu's bigger problems is that his right-hand man, Levin, is firmly committed to passing this. Levin is almost unyielding in his support for this. And so he's having a problem getting Levin to come down off the tree, although other Likud members are now even saying publicly that, if the opposition isn't going to engage with us in dialogue because we're not stopping the legislation, which is their precondition, then we're going to have to soften it ourselves. We'll find a way to soften it, and that's the language they use.
Well, and that begs the question of why, if they're willing to soften it themselves, why the hell does it exist in the language that it exists? That's purely Levin and Rothman?
There's 2 things. One, it was, quote, an opening gambit with the expectation of negotiations. There's actually 3. 2 is that Levin and Rothman would love for this to happen. And number 3 is that the nation is currently being torn apart on this issue. And even if parts of Likud, even if Smotrich himself said that there would be some sort of negotiation or softening and changing of some things to bring to broad agreement, even if there are certain clauses they would have liked to have had, maybe they're willing to roll them back or soften them because of the public outcry. Because we're now 11 weeks into something that brought, up to 500,000 Israelis on one day to the streets to protest against. This is something where families are, dividing how they're going to have dinner in the upcoming Passover holiday because they can't even stomach conversations about this. They're so deeply divided on the issue of judicial overhaul, judicial reform. Even the way we describe it, there are newscasters who call it a regime change. There are others that call this, a judicial reform and a necessary update and amendment to the judicial system. So Israel's really tearing itself apart about this, and Likud members are deeply, deeply upset about this, despite the fact that they're not yet willing to really take a stand. And may I remind you that, one took a soft stand last week. He didn't show up to 2 key votes. sorry, it was this week actually, it's been a long week, he didn't show up to 2 key votes about the reform. They didn't necessarily need his vote, but what Likud did the next day was they sanctioned him. They basically muzzled him for the next 5 weeks.
Said, you better come, man. You better show up to the next
vote.
Yeah,
y'all better show up to the next votes, and we better not see any more protest. So this is something that is highly charged now within the coalition. A lot of the coalition ideologically is either supporting or okay with these reforms, but really upset about what it's doing to social cohesion in the state.
Well, it's nice to see that there's some normal type people who are putting that above their ideology.
Well, they haven't done that much to support that. They're currently upset.
Yet.
We're still waiting. Right?
There's only been the one reading.
Well, no, there have been a number of bills, though. There's only been one reading of the override clause bill and only one reading of the Judicial Selection Committee bill. There's been a separate override bill that was a private member's bill put forward by Rothman that happened a few weeks ago. And there are, about, let's say, 10 other bills in play now that all touch on pieces of this reform. And so there have been many readings. It's just that we haven't really seen anyone take a stand, and no coalition members will commit to not voting for the final readings, which again are expected within the next 2 weeks before we break for Passover recess.
If this bill passes, worst case scenario, do you see, a civil war or something? I mean, that's like really some fatalist speech, but there's definitely some talk about that.
There's absolutely talk about it. The president himself, he's originally a center-left politician, but he is supposed to hold this space of being above the political fray, of, being more of a figurehead or a facilitator for politicians. And he said that this reform is a non-starter, that should be thrown out, that we really could be facing civil war soon. And even the way that we see, the way that that protesters are called anarchists by people on the right.
Yeah, that was surprising.
Yeah, that's our police minister.
We've seen some serious rhetoric in the past about but that's dangerous to say, hey, here's some protesters who by and large are very peaceful.
Yeah, calling them anarchists. A friend of mine sent a video of his sister and one of her friends being spit upon yesterday while protesting by a right-wing voter.
We've seen some pepper sprayers. We've seen
somebody pepper sprayed a crowd of protesters yesterday.
Hit people with cars. That was a wild one.
Right, over judicial reform, something that seems so non-sexy that no one really understood what this was until about 2.5 months ago when Levin said, here's what I want to do to the judicial system. It's kind of crazy to think, right? Because again, it's not just about judicial reform. It is about the future of Israel as a democracy and what it would look like, but it's also, again, about power, because this is how support for this reform is largely playing out across Israeli society. Largely, not exclusively. It's about camps, it's about identities, it's about how, your ideology, your practical goals will or will not benefit if this happens.
This is wild to me.
It's crazy times. It's the Chinese proverb, it's a curse actually, that may you live in interesting times. We're living in interesting times. And it's interesting, I was reading a book by Ray Dalio. He's a hedge fund manager, very successful one, who wrote about economic cycles and specifically, the political underpinnings of them. Or actually, if you understand him, he would say that the economics also played a role in the political cycles. And a lot of what he describes about democratic decline or empire decline, we're starting to see that happen both in Israel and the United States. And I think it's very worrisome. He wrote this book a few years ago, and it feels almost prophetic to the last few months in Israeli politics.
That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Will you speak a little bit more on that?
He talks a little bit about economic inequality. Israel has an economy where 25%, I think, of our GDP or 25% of our revenue, I'm sorry, I don't remember which one right now,
comes from high tech.
Comes from tech, which, only employs about 10% of Israelis. And, the top 1% of Israelis make 19x more than the bottom 50% of Israelis. We have massive and growing income inequality. And we talk about this tech marvel. It's an economy that doesn't work for everyone. We almost have two economies here. We have people who earn that 10% that earns in high tech, and then we have kind of almost everyone else who lives in this heritage economy where teachers are paid, 6,000, 7,000 shekels a month and almost didn't start the school year because they couldn't come to a salary agreement to raise them to another, non-livable wage of, another, let's say, 1,500 shekel bump or so, right?
I'm telling you, that's why I didn't want to teach in this country. Because you can't live off of it.
You can't live
off of that salary.
Yeah, you can't. I mean, journalism is a little bit of my habit. I say I give talks to fund my journalism habit, but, it's not the same. I'm still paid more than a teacher in this country, which is, insane that this critical role is controlled, salary in Israel, teacher salary is obviously controlled centrally by the Ministry of Education for public school. So every teacher in Israel is kind of suffering this right now. And so you have economic inequality that leads to massive dissatisfaction. And then you have these social rifts that start to divide based on this idea of haves and have-nots, that people who have want to maintain the having, that people have not want to upend the system. Does this start sounding familiar when we talk about judicial reform and, this idea of an Ashkenazi elite versus the everyman?
I mean, yeah, it's
populist
interesting
politicians.
Because I don't know, there's always going to be income inequality to a degree. And I'm not saying it's justified, but by any means. But there's the remediation for income inequality oftentimes delves into socialist neo-Marxist policies, which is, I think, a far worse way to exist.
I think part of the income inequality problem in Israel is not just income, it's also expenses. This is a very, very expensive country.
Super expensive.
And there are some very large taxes on this system. First of all, our defense budget, but I don't think that's shifting. Second is what we talked about earlier, sharing the burden. We have a large segment of the population, a large and growing segment that doesn't work, that has a lot of entitlements and state benefits, but does not also serve in the military. There's also the far right, which needs to be protected by the IDF in the West Bank and costs a lot of money to be protected, but many members of those far right settlements also don't serve in the military. And so that's one aspect. And another is that the way our economy is set up, we have basically institutionalized cartels and monopolies. Right. So if we're talking about market concentration, there's a couple of things that Israel needs to address that it hasn't, even just to bring the country in line with European standards, right? We have a lot of protectionist policies, such as these kind of unique to Israel standards. So every good that's imported needs to somehow be changed and Israelified in a way that's
so dumb.
It's so dumb, yeah. And it's expensive, and it limits the pool of importers such that we have a really substantive concentration among who actually imports goods into this country. I heard a statistic a few years ago where something like 80% of commercial products, like things you would buy at a pharmacy, like shampoo, anything, toothpaste, are imported by the same two importers, and they're able to charge 30 to 200% over the price you'd pay in a different country. It's not just that Israel's small; it's that our market's very close.
And it creates a massive barrier to our market for small businesses.
Yes,
they can't afford to have their product sit in a hangar for 6 months until our checkers can go through and decide that the bike that came off the line totally perfect for European market standards can actually ride on the road. It's just obscene.
Exactly. Air conditioners, for example, there's a special Israeli standard. I think you need to put an additional wrap or something within air conditioners, such that they're much more expensive here than, the ones you'd buy in the US.
Do you think that has anything to do with our security standards, though?
No.
Because air conditioners in particular, because we also have for example, all Israeli houses since 1980 need to have a bomb shelter in them.
Right.
And if you have an AC unit in the bomb shelter, you need to have a specific filter called a teken omer set up so that you can shut the airway into the shelter in the event of a gas attack.
That's crazy. No, I don't think they're related at all. I didn't know that, but I don't think the air conditioner that's sitting behind you in the middle of my second floor apartment, which is not bomb safe at all, requires.
Are we in the bomb shelter right now?
Hopefully not. Hopefully not. But
because
no.
it's not safe.
Exactly. That air conditioner does not need a special Israeli wrap that made it more expensive than the one you would buy in the EU. So you have a lot of these things. This government is seeking to address it. It's one of these few things that both the coalition and opposition agree on, the need to reduce a lot of these protectionist policies that make Israel unnecessarily expensive and hard to survive on your low salary. Okay, so when we talk about problems in this state and what Ray Dalio is saying about things that lead to regime collapse, yes, like the economic situation that we're seeing in Israel and income inequality definitely play a role in politics, and it's a little fraught right now, I would say.
It's really interesting that you bring that up, because there's a similar theory, and I don't remember who came up with it or who first published it, but there's this theory of empire collapse and empire decline, and how every empire eventually implodes, and that if you look, for example, at the West, at the United States in particular, we're right at that cusp where it starts to eat itself.
Yeah, I don't think Israel's an empire, regardless of the fact that different opinions towards standing in the West Bank. I don't think Israel's an empire. I don't think it's a
even though we control
power.
The global markets and, and the news.
It's not Israeli.
Oh, I'm sorry. I get the two confused.
A lot of people seem to in their stereotyping. But yeah, I think if we want to switch gears and talk about the United States, I think it's gone from being a thing that intellectuals say to a thing that's almost accepted as a fait accompli, that the United States is in decline. The United States is still a global superpower, but whereas China, let's say, is on a rise, the U.S. is on a decline, and we'll see at what point those meet, likely over a military conflict, possibly over Taiwan, now that the United States has shown that it will not defend its allies' democracy vis-a-vis Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
And Afghanistan.
And yes, but I would say Ukraine is, that was a Eastern European democracy that came out of the ashes of the Soviet Union and that wanted to join NATO. And the US and Europe has let it collapse. We're over a year now into the war in Ukraine. You and I are sipping tea that I bought in Lviv 2 weeks after the invasion.
Which was delicious.
Right? 2 weeks after the invasion. And nobody, initially thought it would be a year later, sort of.
I mean, that's the Russian MO is a war of attrition.
Right. Unfortunately, that includes also the attrition of its own soldiers. It just has more bodies to throw at this problem. But we're also going to see probably Ukraine have territorial concessions at the end of this. And I think other powers, more nascent powers, are looking at this and saying, okay, cool. So like their word doesn't count for anything and I can, do what I want. And, friends of mine who are still in the U.S. are saying that this is what they're talking about now is China and Taiwan, and if the U.S. will come to blows over it.
It's funny, though, because I think China's spreading itself too thin as well. And I've been listening to a number of really interesting experts and thinkers on this who seem to think that China is kind of going to implode on itself as well, that China's actions are not sustainable, and that while they, for a very long time, were right on track with their world domination plan, that they're not going to make it to the end of it. I don't know.
It's hard to know, and I'll just caveat by saying I'm not a China expert. I'm more of a casual, interested, world observer, China observer. But China has kind of moved further into becoming an opaque society, in the last few years with the advent of, Xi Jinping thought and Xi Jinping's consolidation of power. and kind of rolling back some of these hesitant attempts, to have more of a liberal system. And so I think it's even harder to kind of tell what's going on in China than maybe it was before, especially, at the levels that you're talking about, whether or not it will kind of collapse. I think that the Soviet Union's collapse surprised a lot of people because of how opaque the Soviet Union was, and then one day it just kind of announced that it was dissolving itself,
yeah.
right? And I think you're sort of asking, could that be a Chinese situation too? So I have no idea. What China has for it is that it has a roaring economic engine, right? Its growth is not where it was before, but it has a roaring economic engine.
It's very interesting that you brought up the economy in China, because that's one of the experts I'm thinking of. I think it's Peter Zeihan, I think is his name.
Okay.
And I'm so bad with names. I hope I'm not butchering that as well. I had a similar moment in my last interview. James Lindsay, not Thomas Lindsay. But Zeihan, he talks about how, at least I'm pretty sure it was Zeihan, who talked about how China's economic engine in large part is built on stealing intellectual property from other countries. And there's only so long they can do that, because then essentially they're perpetually behind.
Yeah.
Because there's only so much that you can do with stolen technology. You can't get ahead of another country with something that was stolen from them.
Yeah, I don't know about what's going to be in the future, but China has definitely, through its lax observation of intellectual property laws, it's kind of built a name for itself of, quote, stealing the technology and improving upon it and often making it cheaper. I wonder if these tripods you have, for example, well, these are probably off patent by now, but were they from China? I definitely have recording equipment. Yeah, and definitely have recording equipment here that I ordered that probably came from a Chinese company. A lot of my friends in the States, before Trump's presidency, had Xiaomi phones. I don't know.
All right, well, let's come back to Israel, because I think that's where we are. That's our interest.
Let's go back to our bailiwick.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go back to where we're specialized and not. I look at, as an Ola, as an immigrant, this judicial reform, is that the sort of thing you might leave over? Because that's something I know family members, friends who are looking at this from the outside, and they're saying, I wouldn't want to stay there.
Yeah. I've spoken to a lot of people who have said that. I've spoken to a lot of born Israelis who have said that as well.
Yeah.
Again, it's usually people have the means to leave, people who have a solid education, who maybe have a high-tech job that could be, portable elsewhere, who speak some English. These people are throwing around the idea of leaving, whether or not they leave. I'm sure a far smaller percentage of them who they say will leave will actually leave.
Like what happened with Trump, where there's all these people who are, I'm leaving if Trump gets elected.
Well, I'll tell you, I divested from Trump's America after the Muslim ban and missed the entire stock market run up. So, who knows? Who knows? Of course, a lot of that was fueled by just printing $5 trillion that we're now paying for inflation, but that's another story. Of course, I reinvested right before that happened.
You're smart.
Now taking donations. But, do I think people will leave? I think money is already leaving. The bigger issue are some of the long-term, again, economic issues, to go back to the economy. The Bank of Israel said that it's already seeing indicators, at least representatives of it. There were some leading economic figures who said that they've seen evidence of capital flight beyond certain big companies who have publicly announced that.
Just as SVB collapses.
Right. There's capital flight. There's fear among international investors of investing in a country whose courts they don't think they can trust. Obviously, one thing that sometimes happens when you lose judicial independence and liberal democratic values are like nationalizations. So that's fear of what could happen in this economy. Remember in Hungary, I believe Orban clawed back company profits because he said that we need these to support the country now. So these are mine now. These are scary things for investors, right? These are scary things for investors, and I think long term, not just but several leading economists have said long term, the kinds of judicial changes that are being made now portend economic adversity. So I think these might be reasons why people leave, not necessarily because these reforms pass, but if we see some sort of change in civil rights, civil liberties, we see some sort of economic consequences, I think these would be the reasons why people would leave Israel.
Well, and I, with my previous conversation with Vili Abraham, he's arguing that, not so much arguing, really observing, that a lot of these consequences are not just irreversible, but already done. That because so many companies in Israel have moved finances, have moved employees, have closed branches, that's not the sort of thing that you can just pick up and reverse overnight.
Yes, I don't think that's the irreversible damage that has happened, but there has been damage that will be hard to be reversed. So the number of companies that have said that they've pulled their funds out of Israel or will close, small number. What is scarier is that this country thrives on external investment. This country's tech system thrives on external venture investment. And VCs are now saying that they're not going to look at deals from Israel for the next few quarters because they are very wary about the changes here. They want to see how things are going to play out. They'll pass, they'll be upheld, consequences of that on the judicial system, the political consequences, and that's much scarier. That is the lifeblood of Israel's tech economy, which again, we just said was 25% of our tax base.
Yeah.
Very, very scary changes if we cannot somehow roll back investor fears about this country.
And if the judicial reform goes through as it does, how long do you think it'll be before anyone... is that the end of Israel's tech economy?
You're asking for a crystal ball. Right. The question is...
Always.
If this judicial reform goes through and remains unchanged, can investors get comfortable with Israel again? I don't know.
I mean, that's like Bibi going back to his finance minister days, I think would argue, of course.
No, I think Bibi going back to his finance minister days, or even Bibi from before his investigations and indictment and trial would have said, are you kidding me? Judicial independence is the bedrock of our democracy. In fact, he's said things like that in the recent past.
Is he wrong?
That judicial independence is the bedrock of our democracy? I absolutely think it is. I believe in liberal democracy. That's my bias. I believe in liberal democracy. And if you want a liberal democracy, we need an independent court system and we need checks on political power. And fundamentally, this is what this reform will do. It's stripping them. It's not even pretending not to. They're not saying they're preserving, a judicial independence. They're saying we're rebalancing power. We're correcting the balance of power between politicians and judges. And so I'm fearful. I'm fearful of that. I think if, to put my old hat on from the commercial sector, I would be very fearful about investing in a country that's talking about ending judicial independence. I understand why. It breaks my heart, right? Trying to be objective as journalists, but it breaks my heart to see these kinds of cataclysms happening and how this is tearing Israeli society apart and how it might be tearing our economy apart and making this the country and the kind of tech miracle that pulled us out of being a second world country and placed us into the first world, we might be killing it.
Boy.
Yeah, not to depress you and myself too much.
Yeah, I think that what you're saying is what's on everybody's mind, obviously. Yeah.
I think that much like several of the opposition parties cried wolf, people would say cried wolf, about judicial reform before the election, we at the Times of Israel shouted it from the rooftops before the election. I remember in August I had a headline immediately after Likud primaries that said Likud voters just delivered Netanyahu a slate to, enact judicial reform. We were reporting on this in June even. when the coalition now, then opposition, put forward bills to remake Supreme Court justice appointments. So we've been shouting about this for a while. The opposition's been shouting about this for a while. This feels new to voters, but this is...
What do you think that says about really the state of public discourse that we can't trust? Because again, it's sort of what you're saying is, even when these politicians have been saying it, nobody knows who to trust. They can't say, "Oh, well, you're just over exaggerating," or whatever it is.
Well, the hard thing about this is like a lot of what's being discussed is esoteric. It's esoteric. It's technical.
It's boring.
It's boring for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right after the election, but before Levin announced his judicial reform platform, I'd speak to groups and they'd be like, but what about civil liberties? What about women's rights? What about LGBTQ rights? What about secular rights? And
choose your battles and get in line.
Well, no, I said I think that it'll be less harmful than you think for civil liberties, and judicial reform is going to be worse than you can imagine. And, I try to explain what judicial reform is, and I acknowledge everyone's eyes were glazing over, and it felt so esoteric and so out of touch. It's almost so big that you can't believe the momentum of the moment, like the momentousness of the moment, the gravity of the moment, until it's already upon you, because you need to be told 50 times what's happening before you could accept that, a real change of this country's system of governance is upon us.
How do you make it sexier?
How do I make judicial reform sexier?
Yeah.
Well, you'd have to tell me if I succeed in that. But I try to tie it to actual tangible things in our lives. Like what we've been talking about now. We've talked a little bit about civil liberties, but we've talked about the economy, right? We've talked about what could happen to jobs. We've talked about internal strife. We've talked about these protests and the rips in social fabric that people are feeling. These are all very real consequences of this process.
So, I mean, the social consequences really are almost secondary to the issue itself. Mm-hmm. And so, again, how do we make the issue itself more important to the people who don't give a shit?
So there's always going to be a fraction of Israeli society that, quote, doesn't give a shit. Mm-hmm. I think it's quite astounding that 500,000 Israelis were on the streets last week to protest this. Now, does every one of the 500,000 necessarily understand in detail what's happening? No.
Are they even monolithic in what they're protesting? I mean,
no,
exactly.
Absolutely not. There's people who are against the government. There are people who are just politically identify with the opposition and will protest. There are people who politically identify on the right, but are very upset about the way this country's being torn apart. There are people who politically identify on the right, and even more than being upset about the way the country's torn apart, don't agree with all the reforms. Right. So there's a whole smattering of that, but it's really coalescing around this question of the way the reform is being pushed. Mm-hmm. And the fact that something so consequential is just kind of being shoved through unilaterally by a coalition, despite this vociferous opposition from civil society. Right? I remind you, these protests are being led by civil society. They're not being led by politicians.
Right.
The opposition joins some of the protests and speaks at them, but it's not being led by them. And the first few
almost
protests,
seems like they're just using them too. I mean, they're like, I listen to Lapid and I listen to Gantz, and it sounds like they're just getting their soundbite in and kind of leaving it to the protesters to finish the job.
Yeah. I don't even know if I'd say using them. I think it's important that this comes from civil society. And the first protest or so, they didn't let politicians speak because they wanted it to be an apolitical event. Now it's become so politically charged that you can't really get around it. But that was the initial ethos behind it was, no, this is Israeli citizens saying, stop, we don't agree. Yeah. Now the question is, does everyone actually need to understand in detail what's going on? It'd be better, obviously, if people do. Will everyone? No, people are busy. Not everyone's interested. Not everyone wants to invest the time in really understanding. I think it's my job as a journalist to make that as digestible and intelligible as possible. So that's on me to some extent, my colleagues in the press.
So you're not making it sexy enough.
I guess that's the conclusion. Well, I can't wait to see your picture.
So I'm blaming you. I'm blaming you.
Yeah, no. Maybe it's my fault. I'm sorry, Israel. But the question, you said, how do you get more people who are informed about this or involved? This is up to citizens what they want their state to look like.
It's funny because I'm talking to certain people on the street, and I promise we're almost done here. I'm talking to people on the street, and from what I can tell, there's a not insignificant number of people who agree with the right-wing rhetoric that the people who are protesting are these ungrateful anarchists, but not even so much anarchists, but that they're going about this the wrong way, that they maybe don't understand that it's actually really good, and I don't understand why they're protesting. So they're just partisan. They just don't like BB. Like I've heard a lot of that.
Yeah.
And I don't know. Like, do you think that they're ignorant, or is there something that they know that we don't?
I think it's a little bit of what we talked about earlier when we opened this conversation. On one hand, it's almost like these camps are talking past each other, because on one hand, you have people who don't support this reform largely talking about liberal democratic values.
Right.
And on the other hand, you have a lot of supporters of this reform talking about power exclusivity in the state, right? Who holds the reins of control, policies, specific, policy points they want to get pushed through, or areas of contention whereby they felt like the powers that be currently have not respected their views. So we're having these two conversations, and they haven't really come to talk to each other. And what you just kind of said is I think another element of that, right? Yeah.
So, all right, let's wrap this. Let's kind of tie this together. How do you see this ending? I mean, what? I know that's such a huge, again, crystal ball kind of question. But do you see the government softening on this, or do you see this passing and then we're going to have this major conflict until it's reversed, or just a rift between left and right that maybe gets worse, at least before it gets better? How do you how would you predict for the next year?
So all indications are that this will be passing in the next 2 weeks unless something really cataclysmic happens. The coalition is already discussing unilateral softening that it can do, but I think that this will ultimately be a contest for the Supreme Court. That's going to be the real battleground here. Remember, the coalition is pushing laws that would say that the court can't touch basic laws, that has no ability or authority to review basic laws, and yet that's what the court will be doing by looking at this legislation, because this is amendments to basic laws. And so we'll reach a constitutional crisis where maybe the court invalidates pieces of legislation, and then the executive has to decide whether or not it respects the court's opinion, or it's going to ignore the court's opinion.
Which they will ignore it.
Maybe they might also just protest.
I mean, isn't that the crux of this whole thing, though? Is that they're going to say, well, the courts are too activist, and of course they're going to try and consolidate their own power, and that's why we need this even more. I can just see that. They'll likely
say that. The question is what they'll do. And despite the fact that they'll say that, what they might do is they might come to some sort of agreement and amend the laws. Likely still changing some fundamental lines of power between politicians and judiciary, but maybe not to the extent in which the laws will be passed initially. So I think that's going to be the next battleground. It would really be momentous if the government ignored the court entirely. I spoke to a few legal scholars. They can't think of any example in which the government ignored the court entirely. Mm-hmm. In recent history, one of the former Knesset speaker, Yuli Edelstein, a senior Likud lawmaker, rather than obey a court order, quit his post right? So that was kind of the most brazen example they would raise, but no real example of the government completely thwarting a court order. What the government usually does is drag its feet in executing something that it doesn't want to do. Obviously, it wouldn't have the choice here, especially because the court could execute a temporary restraining order and kind of block some things such as the convening of the new Judicial Selection Committee to appoint judges, which will likely be the first testing ground for this potential constitutional crisis.
All right, well, Carrie, I'm very excited. I'm just about done.
I'm very excited to see it.
Me too.
Yeah.
I've been doing this blind, just not even looking. I like to, I have this illustrative style, and so I'm kind of throwing in some black marks here, and sometimes it ruins it, which begs the question, why do I do it? But I can't help it. I just can't help it. I think it looks more fun. And you've been so great, and I'm so happy that we finally got to do this. We've been talking about it for the better part of a week, and for everybody watching, do you have a shameless plug, maybe, somewhere to find you on Twitter or I don't know what?
You can find me at thetimesofisrael.com, first of all. It's where I write. And on Twitter, I'm at CJKeller8, and the same on Instagram. And I like Instagram better, which everyone tells me is the wrong choice for a journalist, but you can see fun stories about the Knesset and protests and all the other things if you follow me.
Why is it the wrong choice for a journalist? Now I'm learning something new here.
Twitter is more the platform for our profession, but whatever, I'm late to social media. Instagram, I only got onto it after I finished business school because my friends told me that that's the only place they'd see the pictures from our trip to Japan. So I was coerced into Instagram. I yet to have been coerced into Twitter.
I'm late to Twitter as well. I have one, just a Poris. And that's my Instagram. That's how little I use Twitter, is that I forget. Oh boy. Well, I'll find it and I'll put it in the comment section below. I'm getting more into social media now, and we'll see how that pans out in the near future.
For both of us.
For both of us, yeah. This is it's a weird new world.
It's interesting times.
Yeah, I guess we can kind of in these last final moments. Are you feeling the threat of ChatGPT taking over your profession and just undoing everything?
There's a word, I forgot it, but there's a word for something that looks like a little bit too human despite not being human, and therefore creates this feeling of creepiness in us.
Oh, the uncanny valley.
Yeah, the uncanny valley. That's what ChatGPT is. It's the uncanny valley, right? It's just human enough, but there's something a little off about it still, where you're a little weird, at least for me. I know a lot of people love it and use the tool. Maybe I feel that way because my profession is, synthesizing information and putting it forward. But my profession is also kind of writing that first draft of history. So I think that we still need people to create that information before the algorithm can actually do something about it. You need someone to report in order to...
so that's what's so funny though about it is you almost don't, because ChatGPT can invent the information on its own, and then it gets indexed on the internet, and then ChatGPT is essentially self-referencing at that point.
That's a great point. So that's a different question, normative question you might want to say about whether or not you want truth in reporting. But I think there'll always be a place for journalists, and I think that there'll always be a place for the kind of judgment that journalists, I think, inherently exercise, even when trying to be non-biased and choosing just which stories to cover, which issues to highlight, which issues need further scrutiny.
Love it.
That said, I have to say that the ChatGPT algorithm, there's an algorithm online to see if it was from ChatGPT, just they used to run essays through a plagiarism checker, and one or two might have slipped through. I think somebody tried to for our blog section, they created a fake ChatGPT entry and then ran it through the scanner, and wasn't ChatGPT enough to trigger the scanner, and that obviously raises questions as to whether or not people are using these tools.
That's really funny. Well, and so there's, and I know this because I've been following this pretty closely online.
Yeah.
I know that there are AI, like you can put a prompt into ChatGPT, get whatever piece of writing that you're getting, and then put that through a different AI that humanizes the writing.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I think that these tools will become, especially you could see like news aggregators, like not necessarily initially reporting the news or offering analysis on the news, but aggregating, this is what happened today, and creating some sort of synthesis of this is what's happened on an issue, timelines like that. I think ChatGPT could displace people on.
Yeah, there was a recent episode of Last Week Tonight where he talked about ChatGPT and AI in general and how it's going to come down likely to those who use it as a tool against those who don't, but that it's not ultimately going to replace humans entirely.
I'd love to see a Last Week Tonight episode written by ChatGPT.
He included a rap about cats made by ChatGPT.
Right. Was it good?
Yeah. It was no, it was not. It was like a rap about cats in the style of Eminem, and it was hysterical, but not good per se. I would say.
I mean, if you asked me to do the same, I don't know if it'd be good either.
I asked
ChatGPT to make me kind of like a 7-day meal plan, so I didn't have to think about cooking. And I said, please don't include pork or red meat. And the first thing was like braised short ribs, and the second was like pork shoulder. So
that's not good.
That was my one attempt. Obviously, the algorithm is just learning. It's gonna get better and better every day. We might have this conversation again in 3 years, and
I think
Carrie, you're an idiot for not seeing this coming.
I think what ChatGPT, I think the quality of what it gives you is as good as the prompt you give it.
No red meat and pork, and then an entire menu of red meat and pork.
I think you are correct. It's kind of like it definitely has a bit of its stupidity in there, and that was actually something also that they kind of brought up in the episode, because there was one prompt and it was just, I guess, testing ChatGPT's understanding to a degree, and it was and it's said something along the question was something along the lines of, what religion will the first Jewish president be? And it's like right in there, and it was like, oh well, there's no way to know what religion is. It's like, well, okay.
Somebody I know gave ChatGPT a few prompts, and one of them was like asked basically to like rate or write an essay about Netanyahu, about Trump and Biden. And for Biden, it wrote the essay, but for Trump and Netanyahu, it was like, I can't engage in something political for one of them, and then said, I don't usually, or like I shouldn't be offering political opinions, but like here's an essay on the other one, and then Biden, there was no disclaimer. So there's also a question as to what is
the bias
into.
of the what is the political bias of the program? Oh man.
But you'll have to check those yourself. I did it and I was able to see that. This was about a month ago. Maybe it's been retrained since then, but
it could be. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting program. I got into a heated argument with it.
Why?
I gave it a prompt on what would win in a fight between Godzilla and AIDS.
Oh.
Really just to
Long
see...
or slow death?
I mean, like, it was really the idea behind the prompt in and of itself was, can it take a hypothetical that really doesn't have... Like, how would it address a hypothetical that doesn't have any real metrics to be used? And it took a very politically correct response line, like it took a line of very political correct response, like saying something about how like, oh, this fight doesn't make any sense because Godzilla is a giant fictional lizard and AIDS is a very serious disease, and I cannot make such a comparison about such a serious disease that people are afflicted with and this and that. And I said, well, just kept pushing it, something along the lines of how South Park said that it's been long enough and now it's funny, and so you can talk about it. And it was like, no, you can't talk about it. It's like, oh boy.
Yeah, well, that's more of an intelligent and empathetic response than I would assume from ChatGPT.
It was surprising. It was a surprising response.
Yeah.
Okay. Carrie, I think it's time for the review. I certainly hope, and again, if you hate it, I'll make you a new one. And I'll make a new one.
You gave me a crystal ball. This is what I'm going to look like in 20 years. He does
look like me. It just looks like me. Just older. Happens to the best of us. This is awesome. All right, everybody. Carrie Keller-Lynn, journalist extraordinaire at the Times of Israel, an amazing, amazing person, and 20 years younger than the portrait of her.